title of which is Translator as Agents. And we have an excellent panel to discuss this subject, who wear a number of different hats. So hopefully we'll have some interesting different... A bit louder? I don't know whether this is going to... Is that better? We'll have some different perspectives on this, but we'll try and keep it quite practical as well, because I'm aware the idea is that perhaps translators in the audience will have some practical advice to take away. So that's the aim in any case. So we have. I'll start with our missing panelist. Maureen, the empty seat here is for Maureen Freely, who will be joining us shortly, but has been.
Has many duties.
Has many duties, and unfortunately, there's a very prestigious guest coming to the book fair, and Maureen will be greeting her, but then coming to join us afterwards. But you will know her as the translator of the wonderful Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk, but she also is a novelist in her own right, but a wonderful and very experienced translator. So that's Maureen, who'll be with us shortly. Stefan is a fabulous translator, but also editor. He has a young but very prestigious and increasingly acclaimed publishing house, and other stories, who had a book on the Booker shortlist last year, the Deborah Levy, but does a number of great books in translation as well. So he has both an editor and translator hat. And then Rebecca Carter, who's got a very long career in publishing, starting out initially as a scout, and then as an editor, and now as an agent, but has always worked a lot with books and translation as well. Firstly as a scout, scouting for foreign publishing houses, and then as an agent worked on a number of great writers, including Nemirovsky. As an editor, working on a number of great writers in translation, and now as an agent. And I don't know how many foreign writers you have now, but certainly a long and a wealth of experience in translated literature. So I was just going to ask myself. Oh, sorry. I am an agent. I work. My publishing career started in Paris, in fact, where I worked for Flammarion in their English language department, and then I worked for an agency called Susanna Lee Associates, which is very international. We have an office in Paris and an office in New York, and represent writers both writing in a number of different languages, and we sell translation rates very widely as well. And we are in an interesting position of commissioning translations ourselves quite regularly, which is something that not many agents do. So we're very hooked up to the whole translated literature scene, and I'm also on the PEN Writers in Translation Committee. So what I was going to start by asking is how do you go about finding interesting writers, both in the languages that... Oh, so perhaps when you answer this question first off, you could tell us which languages you speak and translate from and read. And then, so firstly I'd like to know how do you find interesting writers in the languages that you speak and read, and also in the languages that you don't? Where do you get your recommendations from? How do you come across them? And perhaps you could also answer that firstly as an editor, and then also as a translator.
Okay. So, firstly, as a publisher.
Firstly, tell us.
Yeah.
Sorry. Firstly, which languages do you read and speak?
So I'm a translator from German and Portuguese, and I also read and speak French, and I sort of can't really speak Spanish, but as any good Brazilian tries, I sort of speak Portuñol, which is basically Portuguese with some Spanish words thrown in. So I can sort of read Spanish stuff with a dictionary, but I tend to leave the reading of Spanish to other people and many translators. And so when And Other Stories is probably not your average publishing house in how we go about things. So some of you will sort of know already, we have reading groups often, not all the time, but we have reading groups where a bunch of translators can suggest a few books that look really interesting, that they would all like to read. It's mainly sort of over a course of, say, a spring or an autumn, and then people meet up to discuss those books. And the nice thing about that is, well, the nice thing when I can read the language, like the Portuguese one, is that I just have an excuse to read some really good books. And generally what happens then, we all completely disagree about what we think about the books, which is also fun. But sometimes when I can't read the language, like we've had reading groups in Russian, Arabic. There's a Polish one at the moment that Antonia is having fun with running. What other languages can't I read that we've had reading groups in? There's a few. Lithuanian. There's quite a few, but no, I've lost my memory at this. Too much information at this fair, and so those are great because then I can hear what translators and other, people who like and know their literature think about these authors, and those are books that they have suggested. So we get to then hear about books and find books through those recommendations. Yeah. And
how do you form the reading groups? How are those?
It's just sort of a mixture of people who know what we're doing, getting in touch and saying, I'd like to be in one, or I'd like to run one, or us getting in touch with some people we know who are translators or just readers of a foreign language.
I have a linked question to that, but we'll come back to it. Firstly, I'd like to ask the same question to Rebecca.
Well, actually, I think I'm come from the sort of opposite pole to Stefan, and in some ways probably Stefan started And Other Stories in opposition, well, not exactly in opposition, but in frustration with me, possibly, I don't know. I'm now an agent. I've been an agent for 2 years, but before that I was an editor at Random House for 15 years, and I was always very interested in books in translation. And actually, one of the first things I acquired in translation makes for perhaps quite an exemplary story, because I think And Other Stories has it's like a project to translate things, and it's not an academic exercise, but it's a rigorous exercise in that you feel like you're wanting to look at the books of a country. You want to pick a book in the context of other books from that country. You want to know what's going on in Lithuanian literature and choose an exemplary book, or choose a book that you love, that you think will work for a British audience. When I joined Chatto and Windus in 1997, I found in the file a long memo, beautifully typed, of how much money all the books in translation that they had published had lost, with a big sort of capital letters thing at the bottom, no more books in translation. And so I kind of arrived just at the moment when Chatto had really stopped having been publishing Proust and Joseph Roth and all these incredible people, had kind of stopped doing it a bit. But I was very interested. I read French and Italian, and I was very interested also because it was a way as a young editor, that I could kind of find things, and like the hot agents weren't necessarily going to send me the hot book as the young assistant editor. So I thought, well, if I start looking around in languages that I can read, French and Italian, I might find interesting stuff. And so one of the first things I did was a book called Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress, which came to me because a friend who lives in France had been watching Apostrophe, which was then the big book program in France, and said, well, I've just seen this incredible author. The book was published by Gallimard, so I rang up Gallimard and they submitted it to me. And he was a Chinese author writing in French. I could read it in French because I could read French, and I published this book. And then weirdly, I then became the editor of lots and lots of books in Chinese because I published this Chinese author. It attracted other authors. Through that, I met translators of Chinese into English who then started recommending me things. But it was a completely kind of random. It wasn't like I set out to think I'm going to become an expert in Chinese literature and publish the greatest Chinese novelists. It was completely haphazard. And I think that's what you as translators have got to understand when you're approaching publishers who aren't as rigorous and benevolent to the world of translation as And Other Stories. Yeah, but there are levels of haphazardness. And I think what you'll find is that publishers, and I'm sure all of you do find, that apart from the few publishers who make that their goal, they're really just looking for the book that's going to work in the English language, and they want it to be filtered by you, and it's quite a random process. They're not going to say, how does this book fit into the world of Turkish literature in a sort of coherent way? They're going to say, hey, this is a great Turkish book that we think will work for a British audience. Let's just try that, is my feeling. I don't know if you have, so in your experience as a...
Absolutely, and you're jumping all over my carefully orchestrated...
Oh, sorry.
but that's okay.
Yeah.
We can adapt. Yes, that is very much my experience, and actually, I think that's something that perhaps we can talk about a little bit further down the line, is how commercial translators should be, because I think often the approach is different. How a translator or somebody who's sort of passionately interested in the literature of a particular country and a language that they speak, how they see the books and the literature is probably very different to how a British publisher or agent who is trying to sell a book that is going to sell in lots of copies sees it. And I think that's a challenge that translators sort of do need to overcome. Maureen, welcome.
Hi. Have you all spoken? Now I'm just going to be the idiot who repeats everything. Yes?
No. Well, my first question was how you get recommendations. I suppose in many ways actually it was a good question to start with, because as a novelist and translator, you're not actually somebody who publishes books. But how do you get your recommendations? Do people in languages that you speak and also languages that you don't speak? Maybe that doesn't happen to you so much, but
well, I mean, the first time when I was translating Orhan Pamuk, he was an old friend. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. He's an old friend, and still is an old friend, miraculously. And so I loved his books, and so that's why I took the plunge. And after that, there were many offers, and I had no time, and I wanted to write my own books and so on. Yeah. So that was a big problem because there were a lot of I was getting too many recommendations and not enough time to form an opinion. Now I'm trying to develop a network of brilliant young things in Turkey who love Turkish literature. Yeah. And so we make I ask them to read books, and then we take it from there. I really do think that editors and agents and publishers should not have to bear the brunt, because I am a bit of an evangelist. I'm not an evangelist. Sorry, I'm not a missionary. but I really find it very frustrating when books are taken out of context, including classics, because we're bringing a number of classics from Turkish into English, and I want people to have an idea of the rich history of the literature that's been ignored in English until now. And if you're just cherry picking, people aren't even reading the books properly. Yeah. So we're getting there. I mean, we're bringing a number of really beautiful 20th century classics into English, and trying to build the stable of translators as well. Yeah. So,
yeah. And I guess, I mean, that's a challenge that we sort of touched on. Is sort of trying to, I mean, you're so established and respected and admired now that for you to sit down with the publisher and say, I feel that for books in Turkish this would be an approach to take, you could do that. But I think for a lot of translators starting out, it's that's a much harder thing to do.
Well, I mean, that's when I was starting out as a novelist, I got a tremendous amount of help from older novelists, and also the sorts of editors and publishers we had in those days. Yeah. Liz Calder, for example. Yeah. And so now that I'm a lot older than Liz Calder was when she helped me, I feel it's my duty to help younger writers, and particularly younger translators. Yeah. And it's not just it's as much an artistic as well as a business endeavor to bring them in and work with them. And also they're so much more fun. so
Could I ask a
enlightened
question?
self-interest is what my father always accuses me of.
Where are your Turkish? Where is this series of Turkish books being published? Are they? Is it with a specific publisher, or is it? Or
No, I mean, that would be quite nice. I mean, I really, every once in a while, I've gone back to my friends in Turkey and said, you really do an Everman's sort of collection and just really get all of the really important works and have them translated with care and produce them. And they look at me bewildered because it just, well, I suppose they're looking from their point of view, how many languages am I asking them to do this in? Where would the money come from, and so on? But I think that what we have is second best, and it's looking very good because the publishers who are bringing Turkish books, literature into English, do tend to know each other, and they're part of our kind of network. So Penguin Classics, Archipelago Books,
so
completely
they're all
wonderful.
with different people.
Bloomsbury, but they all, I mean, they're all, we're all trying to do the same thing, and we're all interested in more than one literature. I think that's important part of it. I love Latin American and Spanish literature. So.
And I think sort of there's a couple of sort of themes already emerging, I think, that will be important takeaways from this session, which are networks and credibility. Those are both things that I think are really important. But Stefan, I wanted to come back to your reading groups, because one question I had is if I'm a young translator, I find an author I really love, I start working with this author, I do quite a lot of work on spec, I've got no guarantee of anything happening, but I'm very passionate about this particular writer. Perhaps I'm in one of your reading groups, I'm a big champion for this author, you're interested. How much work do I do for free? What arrangement do I have with that author? What obligations do I have to the author, and what obligations does the author have to me? And what happens if you say, this is a really great project, but I don't want you to translate it, I want to get some samples done, I want to get... How does all of that work?
I think, it's not really different for translators starting out than it is from any freelancer starting out in any field. When you're starting out, you have to be prepared to do some things for free just to show, to have a portfolio of work, to show what you can do, to try and get people interested in what you're doing, and certainly it's only after you've got their interest that you might get a contract, and yeah, I mean I think that's definitely but also if you're starting out as a literary translator and you're not actually you can't really be bothered to translate some extracts or something of this author, then is the author really that good? Are you really that interested? I don't know. I mean, I translated a novella once because it was so good, and I thought people should publish it, and they still didn't. So that's why I had to start And Other Stories. And strangely enough, irony of ironies, but now it is finally, sort of 15 years later, going to be published by Penguin Classics. But that's
it's a long road.
Yeah, but no, I think yeah, definitely. As getting into literary translation, don't think of it in the first instance as something that where every hour is going to at the beginning sort of pay off financially. Get into and I don't need to tell you this. You'll all sort of know this. You get into it because you love the literary translation, and then down the line things will work out. Yeah.
But then what about how, I suppose I'm also interested, because I have been in this situation a couple of times when a translator's come to me with a project that I think could potentially be interesting, but I'm not 100% convinced by the translation. And that puts me in an awkward situation because the translators brought it to me, the translator's involved, I don't have any relationship with the author independently, but it's in the author's best interest that this project is given its best shot, and I as an agent am not convinced that the translator approaching me is necessarily, or I might just want to get another sample, or
I think there's two things. I mean, I think often samples can arrive that are not completely ready and completely polished, and I think as an agent or a publisher, it's good to then just think, well, does this sample have potential? Is it someone who maybe hasn't done much translation yet, but with editing and practice will be good, or is it someone who maybe is not the best translator for that book, and And of course,
have you had a situation where you've had to sort of break up an author-translator pairing that's come to you and reassign?
Well, it's a very good question. We haven't. We do a lot of. We take a lot of translators' suggestions, and if they've suggested a book that we like, I think we've pretty much always then gone with that translator. I'm trying to think if we haven't at any time. I think perhaps there have been times when a translator suggested a book to us that looked pretty good, but maybe with the translation not being great did sort of make us not pursue it. That's possibly happened. Yeah.
Maureen, what's your feeling about this?
Well, I was feeling how lucky I was not to be a publisher or an editor, but I do know I have been involved in situations when the editor said so and so is a promising translator but not ready yet. Would you be willing to work together? And of course, that's another issue. Sometimes you can work together, sometimes you can't. Yeah. But an awful lot of sort of emerging translators just need more practice, or they need to work closely with somebody who's bringing out all the issues and so on. And translators can get better, not through direct instruction, but through practice, really. Yeah.
So Rebecca, I want a hard-nosed commercial take on this now. You're a publisher
I'm sort
and
of
you're
thinking
an agent.
that it's wonderful when young translators or new translators bring you projects because I worked at Harville Secker, so we were doing a lot of books in translation, and I desperately relied on recommendations from people who really were scouting those literatures and knew those literatures, and definitely wanted those young translators to give me recommendations, but it's true that I wouldn't necessarily then have been absolutely sure that I was going to want to commission them, and I always thought it was incredibly important, and I always did commission several samples for translate, even if something had come, if it was obvious that the translation was the perfect translation from the word go, I wouldn't have done this, but generally I would commission several samples and then spend quite a lot of time thinking about them before. Yeah.
I was just saying, but the thing is, there's a risk. There's always a risk in a new translator, but there's also a risk in a very established translator, because a very established translator might be overworked. And from talking to other publishers, I know that sometimes a publisher will go with a very established name, and actually it's not always a great experience.
Yeah,
so there's no guarantees anywhere.
And actually, with Suite Française, I ended up commissioning sort of probably 7 or 8 samples, and I went with the person who had done the least literary translation in the end. So that sample process I didn't go with the people who had lots and lots of books under their belt. So it can work in the favour if you keep an open mind about it, I think. But I was just going to say that all those, even if I didn't end up commissioning those translators who were giving me advice, it was just a brilliant way to start a dialogue about books. I mean, I don't think you and we never worked together on a translation, but we kind of had dialogue about German books, and you read things for Harville Secker before, and other stories, maybe still do. I don't know, probably not. But, and it was just, you form relationships, and those relationships are crucial. So I think for a translator starting out, to be a reader for a publisher, even if you're not going to end up actually doing that translation in the end, but to be an advisor to the publisher and to bring ideas and to bring your expertise is a brilliant way to start forming those relationships.
And were you very upfront with translators when they approached you? Did you say very early on, I'm really interested in looking at this project, but I have to tell you now that I won't necessarily take you as a translator? What's
quite interesting is because we were talking before, and I actually can't remember a project that I took on that came through a translator initially. Yeah, I did occasionally get sort of slightly suspect brown envelopes from somebody that I'd never heard of saying, I've translated the whole of this 500-page novel and here it is, and would you take it on? And usually it was like, and anything was usually something that had been sent by a foreign publishing company, an agent. Yeah. The the exception to that actually is with Chinese literature, where this group of translators have got together. They call themselves Paper Republic, and made it their mission to get more Chinese literature into English. But they then started to learn the publishing industry and to understand the publishing industry. And the problem with those suspect brown envelopes was that they were just coming from people who had absolutely no understanding of publishing whatsoever. And so actually, I never found myself in a position of just taking a book from a translator I'd never heard of. Just never happened.
Go ahead, you go first.
No, I was just thinking it's partly a matter of sort of Havel, Secker versus And Other Stories in a way, because I think it makes much more sense for And Other Stories to take translators' suggestions, because we don't really like it when translators sort of get too sort of market sort of trying to suss the market and why this book will be good for the market. We just like it when people say this is a brilliant book and and why it's brilliant. Because it's the bigger publishers that are more thinking in terms of how much market share will this book have, or how, and we a bigger publisher will do their profit and loss on the book and work out whether it's going to make them money in an ideal world or not, and we don't really do that.
But because you have so cleverly positioned my chair in a particular direction, I'm looking at the Armenian Pavilion now. Almost all of the books I've translated have come to me through editors and publishers I know. But there is a very interesting strand of writing in Turkey by feminist scholars and activists to open up the story of the hidden histories of the Turkish Republic. And they're absolutely brilliant books. They're not huge sellers or anything, but I think it's really, really important to have them in English, because it's a sort of narrative, especially as we come up to the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, that we need to have there, and that we need to know that people in Turkey are addressing this and also looking at their own national identity through this prism. So for those books, there are 3 books, and the last 2 in particular, I really did agent those because I wanted.
Yeah, tell us, how did you go about that? Who did you approach? How did you?
Yeah, there was a book called a book I translated called Anneannem, which is my grandmother, which Verso published, and that was the publisher in Turkey was a friend through Penn, and she gave me the book. I fell in love with it. She said Verso doesn't like the translation, talk them into it. So that's what I did in that case.
And did you redo the translation?
No, it was just a sample. So it's a really difficult book.
So did you get somebody else to do it, or how?
I did it.
You did it. Okay.
I did it. And then I wrote the preface, because it's a very, very hard book to read from the outside unless you have some preparation. There was then a sequel called Torunlar, which is the grandchildren, which is the first one was about the human rights lawyer who wrote it, finding out that her grandmother, who had brought her up, was actually not a Muslim, but had been pulled away out of the death marches and saved by a gendarme, and then had a secret identity. And she kind of narrated it as a Turk with a broken heart. And she opened up the subject for many, many families in Turkey. I mean, it's estimated there are at least 2 million Turks with this sort of background, I would say probably more. And so many people wrote to her and the publisher. So 5 of them went around the country collecting stories, mostly told over and under assumed names. And then they wrote a feminist scholarship thing at the end of it to bring up the level. That was Verso decided that they'd done the genocide. So we just kept looking, and finally, through a friend of a friend of a friend, we found a publisher. I mean, it's sort of an academic publisher to take it on. And when I was finishing that up in America, and I just said, "Oh, what a pity that we've never been able to place the biography of the great Turkish-Armenian journalist Hrant Dink," and he went, "Oh, my friend Hrant Dink." And so he bought that as well. But I would never do that unless it was something I really felt passionately about. Yeah.
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 But when I said about wanting the translator to understand publishing, I wasn't only meaning in a purely mercantile and because I also think because there are elements of are the rights free in this book?
Yes.
How many editions of this book already exist in English? I mean, think very very basic things like that. Sorry, so an understanding of whether that translator has been in touch with the person who holds the rights, not just the author, but whoever that author is represented by, be it agent or publisher. I mean, it's a sort of, that's why Paper Republic have been so successful with the Chinese, because they have to sort of ascertain who actually is controlling, in an incredibly complicated market like China, who is actually controlling the rights to these books, and that's a really crucial thing to understand, I think.
And it was because one of my first questions was going to be who from the panel has an example of a translator approaching them about a book that then has gone on to be published either by themselves or by somebody else. So this was specifically for Stefan and Rebecca, because it hasn't happened in my experience either, actually. I have to say, there hasn't been a case where a translator has approached us, and we get approached by translators a lot with projects. And I don't think I can think of an example when we have gone on to sell a book from a translator's recommendation. Things have come about in different ways, but it's tricky. I mean, obviously, And Other Stories is a slightly different model and a slightly different example, and that's great. But I think there are challenges, and again, I think we're touching on how you can tackle some of those challenges. Paper Republic sounds like a brilliant example.
Well, I think sort of to find out who has the rights, and then say, for example, I'm selling a French book at the moment with the help of a translator who has done the sample for it, and
was that,
so.
But you knew the author already, or
so?
How did that pairing come to you?
I'm representing it on behalf of the French publisher, so
okay.
I'm in a sense I'm the rights holder, although I'm not the primary rights holder. But what I was going to say here was that in terms of, so rather than you as translator going to the publisher saying, I think you should translate this amazing French book, if you find who holds the rights and you say to that person, could I please do a sample for you to help you sell that book into English? That's a brilliant way of, because basically publishers and agents who are selling books in translation aren't necessarily going to pay to commission a sample unless they're absolutely convinced that they're going to earn that money back. But if you as translator go and say, look, I'll help you with this, I'll write a free sample and help you get this, that's a really good way of integrating yourself into the system.
And then I think in a totally ideal world, your language's equivalent of Maureen, and you then I think that this network of translators and mentors and having figures who are experienced and who are credible and who are connected and who know people who will help out as well. I think that's a sort of theme that seems to be coming up again as well.
And, yes, and I would agree that the relationship has to precede the discussion about a particular book, so that and also the shared passion for literature. So if you know you can work with people and you know that they're there, then you know when you go to them for questions. Really, what you're talking about in a certain way is the Ottoman term, the dragoman. So it's more than a translator, but somebody who's going to negotiate the cultural and political landscape for you, and who a dragoman you can trust. Not all dragomans are trustworthy. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, well, no, actually, that's because publishers are incredibly dependent on their advisors in all languages, and if you become that helpful person, you can have a lot of power.
An example of this kind of working relationship is my relationship with Bill Swainson at Bloomsbury. We worked with him for years because I love Latin American and Spanish writing, and he has a lot of those authors, and so I loved their work. And every time they came to England, we would do an event for them at the University of Warwick, where I teach, or in London. And so when he became interested in Turkey, which was not something I asked him to do, he came to me and he said, help me research these authors, and then this network also helped. So it's again, the trust has to happen before, so it's not an instrumental conversation. It's about doing something together.
If someone writes you a reader's report, how do you need to know that person as well as read their report somehow. You need to have had lots of conversations about all sorts of books. You need to understand what they read, what they like, in order to be able to interpret their reader's report. It's not good enough saying, read this German book for me and tell me what you think. It's got to be within the context of their taste and their sort of understanding.
Exactly. When my translation mentee, who is now my co-translator with Bill, when we were looking at this list of books, we were looking for a Bill book. But I knew his list because I loved his list. So,
which is wonderful. And I guess getting to that point is the challenge. You know, publishing is an incredibly relationships-based business, and because you do need to understand people's tastes, you need to know what they like, you need to know what they're passionate about. So it's a sort of complicated line to tread between genuine, authentic passion. You can't fake that stuff, but also understanding who you're talking to and what their role in the process is and what their kind of hopes and aspirations
what they need.
And
what they need, really important.
And actually, oddly, because having been an editor who was seeking books, I'm now an agent trying to sell books to publishers. And actually, what I choose to take on is very much guided by what editor I think I can place it with in the publishing. So I there might be a perfectly good book, but I can't think of who I would sell it to, and therefore I don't take it on. But if I read something and I think, oh, that's a Bill Swainson book, then I'm going to take it on because I think, oh yeah, I can send it to Bill, and so it's really guided. And actually, I think for translators to look at the editors who are acquiring translated fiction, to see what they publish, possibly go in and ask if you can meet them, to have a coffee with them, talk to them what they're looking for, is a brilliant way of going about sort of
and just reading. I think it becomes fairly clear once you read a bunch of books from that publisher editor's list, sort of what their taste is, and as well. I mean, if that's another option always, reading.
But also, if you have been a publisher, then you know just how hard it is in-house to get a house behind. Well, to buy it to start with, and then to support it later on. So that gives you an advantage as the agent to understand what they need.
You can give them the ammunition, which is, the problem is that a sample is often not enough for them to make a decision. And a sample and a reader's report, unless the reader's report is from somebody they really, really trust, is often not enough. So,
but I found when we were working with Bill this time last year, it was. We went through several drafts, and that was really fun because he'd say, "Yes, we're almost there, but we need this. Can we do?"
What before he gave it to his colleagues?
Yeah, that was good because we knew each other and we could cooperate. But you cannot. It's really hard to cooperate in this way with somebody you don't know.
He'd already acquired the book at that point.
No, he hadn't. No, we were.
This was
trying to create the ammunition.
First of all, he had to. There were various books that we were looking at, and so we did but these very brilliant other people working with me did the reports and got paid for them, by the way.
Oh, good. Wait, who paid? Who paid?
Bill.
Okay.
I mean, Bill's people.
Yeah.
And
so
then
he paid even though he hadn't acquired the book.
No, it was just for reader's report.
For reports.
And then he decided on the one that I kind of thought that we kind of hoped he would. And at that, then he said, "We'll need to work together, work up a proposal." And so that's something we did together. And we, there was a report, there was a synopsis, but there was also a sample translation. And the best part was sending in the translation of the two chapters that John Anglis and I had worked on. And then he came back with his editorial suggestions. They were so good. So I just really wanted it to go through because there's nothing better than a really good editor.
It is true that the editor is just the starting point because then the editor has to convince their team. And so, sorry. My enthusiasm there too. So helping an editor have, and that actually might involve translating reviews. It's amazingly, because I found myself, I did this with this French book I'm submitting. I found myself, fortunately, because I speak French, able to I just sit down and translate the reviews. But a lot of people can't do that. So helping the editor do that is really.
reminds me that Ros Schwartz, who's probably here, has certainly been around a lot. Ros Schwartz, very, very good and active translator. She wrote an article about sort of, if you want to suggest a book to a publisher, what sort of things should you put in a proposal, and things like review quotes and such. And it's really, really helpful. And we, she said we can send it out to people. I'll ask if she lets us put it up on our website or something, because it's a really sort of handy list of things like that, reviews, or if you can find out from the original publisher sales figures, or other countries that it's been sold to, because all those things make the publisher feel sort of secure and like, okay, there are lots of people that are actually interested in this book. And
which we as an agency representing a lot of writers not writing in English do. So we will nearly always get a sample, and in some cases get the whole thing translated. We'll always have translated quotes. We have very good pitches. We've really, we started out in France, and a lot of French publishing houses didn't necessarily have in-house native English speakers, and so their sales material wasn't great. And so we found a real corner of the market and kind of cleaned up.
It's amazing as an editor how off-putting it is to get a folder like that from a foreign publishing company full of reviews in German, and the only thing you can really sort of look at is the photograph of the author, and and actually to have and also not just necessarily just quotes, but to have, say, a full interview with that author translated is absolutely fascinating. Of course, now you can put it into Google Translate, which I have to say I do, because I want to know what they're saying about this person. So I do. It doesn't really matter.
You can't say that in a room full of translators.
But I mean, I just need the facts,
if you did that with Turkish into English, you would not find out the facts. You would find out how much Google Translate doesn't know about grammars that are different from English.
So I've got one final question, and then perhaps I'll throw things open to the floor. I imagine there are lots of questions in the audience for our panel. But so my final question is, what is it that makes a book work in translation? Are there kind of particular factors aside from the we all know very brilliant books that are brilliant in the original and brilliantly translated that have disappeared? What's the magic dust?
Stefan.
Well, it's a slightly loaded question, I would say, because what is a book that works? Is a book that works Harry Potter? Harry Potter works, but a book that only sells, less copies than the publisher would like also can work. And I'll be completely open. For example, on our list, one of the titles that so far has not sold, or one of the authors that is not our best-selling author so far, is a fantastic Argentine writer called Yossi Javilio, who's a cult author in Argentina. And we did Open Door, and it didn't sell great. But of the people who subscribe to our books and get a bunch of books or have read various of our books, so many people have come up and said, "Oh, that's amazing! That's my favorite book. I just, it's the best thing I've read last year." So it's this weird thing where. And then we published a second book, and it's been similar, Paradises. And for each book, we really struggled, like with a lot of books, struggled to get as many reviews as we'd like. We had a couple of sort of mainstream reviews in each case. We didn't sell as many copies as we would like, but we had so many people that loved it, and really, like me, thought that this is a really original voice. That did the book work? In a way, it worked. It reached people. I never thought it would be the book that reached the most people. So anyway, that's why the question was, there's different ways to approach it. Yeah. But and then the other bit about sort of what means a book sort of, I think you're sort of saying sort of catches on in a big way. I mean, I think if publishers knew that.
$1 million question. Yeah.
I think that a good translation, or a book that works in translation, is a book that takes you, the reader, into another world.
Yeah.
And then in that other world, if you're really there, it will resonate and make you want to find out about the other worlds that are connected to it. And so from an artistic point of view, well, that's all I'm trying to do. And I think that tends to make the book work at either end of that spectrum, just to take you in there. That's quite a difficult thing to do. But if you know that that's your aim, you have a shot at it. Also, from the translator's point of view, and this is really mean of me, but to love the book really makes a big difference.
I think there's sort of I find often with books in translation that they sort of divide themselves into two camps that I find very difficult. I have to kind of ward off, because I love books that teach me about somewhere else, sort of in a sort of almost academic way, that I think, oh yes, now I really understand what the sort of subculture in that barrio of Buenos Aires is about. But that's not necessarily why readers are going to go and read that book. So as a publisher, I have to kind of, well, now as an agent, ward off my people should know what it's like in this place, and we should publish something that they will take them into that world, and a piece of literature where that sort of teaching is kind of immaterial. It's so part of the book that it's just a natural part of the reading experience.
So no shoulds.
Yeah, no shoulds. Yeah. And it's very easy with translated literature to do quite a lot of shoulds because there are a lot of lacks in our knowledge of places around the world that you feel should be filled. But whenever it's a should, that's actually was my New Year's resolution. Yeah. Was no more shoulds.
I think that's a really good takeaway. No shoulds.
Yeah,
I'm going to remember that one.
Yeah.
And it's not even grammatical.
No, I know. Exactly, but why should it be? Any questions from the audience? Oh, is there there's a roving mic, I think. Oh, but it's not coming to you.
I'll stand up because I can't see you back there. I'm interested in this idea of asking the rights holder to take your sample, because is that not expecting them to take something of a risk? Because if I'm a publisher and I want to market this book in English, but my own English is not very good, and a translator who I've never heard of gives me a sample and says, please use it, I mean, they could be completely misrepresenting the book, and my sample might be absolute rubbish.
I think that is. I mean, that's actually
does it actually
that's
work?
an issue, and I think that rights holders have that anxiety all the time. But I mean, I actually sort of had one situation where, when I was an editor, where a very, very estimable French rights holder who spoke impeccable English, there was an argument about whether the American translation was better than the UK translation, and she didn't feel even equipped to arbitrate in that situation. And that was where two very good translators were going head to head. So I think that is difficult, and often rights holders send out quite bad sample translations, and it can kind of kill a book. But of course, you're all brilliant translators, and those rights holders would be only too happy to find your sample. So I mean,
I have slightly found myself in this situation where I've been approached by a translator, and the translation's not brilliant, but I think the project could potentially be interesting. And it's challenging because then it's difficult to know. And they've both been from, so one is from Burmese and one is from Icelandic. So both unusual languages where there are not hundreds of translators. And it's tricky to know. It's tricky to know what to do. I'm sort of wrestling with both issues at the moment. In both cases, the projects themselves sound potentially very interesting, but I haven't got a sense from the certainly what I've got is not something I could usefully use at the moment. So I'm trying to figure out what to do. But often the person receiving the sample will be discerning enough to know that the translation's just not very good, or that it's potentially been misrepresented, and also everyone will Google the original person as well and get a sense of who that writer is and how they do in their own country, and those kinds of things.
What I'm wondering is, from the point of view as a translator, is it better off actually putting together my sample, my pitch, all my bits and pieces, sending it myself to the British publishers after having contacted the rights holder to see if the rights are available, rather than approaching the rights holder and saying, here's my sample, do you want to try and market this in the English market?
I think if it comes from the rights holder, it's always I think it's always better, because the publisher will then think, this rights holder is sort of embracing this person in a way. Do you think? I don't know.
It's personally not.
The credibility issue, I think, a bit. We've talked about the brown paper envelope and it's hard. You get this stuff through. You've never heard of the person.
But it is so personal. But personally, when I get yet another email from, I'm sure there are rights people here, but yet another email from rights people with yet another book, is like bombarding you with their books, and you don't know whether they actually like the book or they've actually read the book, but they have to. It's their job. They have to send you the books. So personally, when I get a translator sending in a suggestion, and they really think it's a great book, I think that that for me actually is more interesting. But I know. I mean, the trouble is, I mean, there's always so many books that get sent to you, and you know that half of them that you say no to are going to be great books that you just either haven't had the time to really give enough time to, or a day when you've really got there aren't enough Sundays to have leisurely reading. That's the thing, and so unfortunately it's the same for English language authors and potentially authors that could be translated. Some great authors fall through the cracks, and
in my case, it has been I think literature like Turkish being a small community, small international community. I think it makes more sense to be on friendly terms with everybody involved, and it's always worked better if the publisher, having investigated it, the possibility of my being available, whatever, then says I'll talk to the rights holder. So, and then and they're better at that.
I think I've had experience of people they've written to me and said, I've contacted the rights person and they say the rights are free and here's my translation. And I suppose part of me has thought, well, why hasn't that rights person said, yes, come and help me? Why have they said you contact the publisher directly? Because it sort of sounds a slight alarm bell to me that the rights holder didn't want to say, yes, I endorse this translation, I suppose.
But if you know all the people involved...
Obviously it's completely different if I know the translator, I know the right, it's just when it's more random. Yeah.
I think we have another question here, and then here. Sorry.
So my experience as a translator of doing what you say, contacting the rights holders, then they say, the rights are free, go and pitch it to the publishers. As far as I can make out, it's because they don't reckon that British publishers are going to take anything on in translation, and they can't be bothered to do the legwork if they've got a translator volunteering to do it.
Yeah,
and
well,
that's
no, I'm sure that's actually also the case. Yeah.
I think we've got another question at the front here.
Does the process work the same in reverse, i.e. from English into a foreign language?
I suppose all of us are slightly less experienced the other way round. I think the difference with English is that it's so widely spoken and read that it's quite a lot more accessible to people often. I don't know whether any of the rest of the panel have thoughts on that. I mean, the processes essentially are the same.
Translators recommending an English book to be translated into French, for example. I think that does happen. I mean, you talk to French publishers who have incredibly strong relationships with translators. I'm sure it happens that those translators are recommending things. Definitely.
I think we had another question over there. No.
Just to follow up on the colleague's question here, in my experience of doing sample translations for foreign rights people, they speak enough English to know if your translation's any good. I mean, they will get you initially. I've only ever done this through a recommendation, but generally they can tell you've done a good job with the translation. I don't think that's an issue. But slightly alarmed by the idea of offering to do that for free. I would not recommend that, and I'm not quite sure why that's being recommended here. It's undercutting other translators. It's wrong on a number of levels.
I think there's a difference. I mean, if the publisher asks you if the publisher's commissioning you to do a sample of a book that they like, I think that of course they should always pay you. But if you just are really passionate about a book and no one's going to commission a sample, then that's sort of what I was suggesting. You might want to do one.
You might.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, it's a good point, and this is another issue I've kind of come up against with this in a recent case, where the author's paying, which is fine, but the author can't endlessly pay, and who does pay? We're not. I haven't taken the author on. I don't read Icelandic. I can't, to even have a chance, we need something in English. And currently that's all coming out of the author's pocket. But that's tricky. That's tricky too. I feel uncomfortable about asking the author to pay much more. It's a tricky question. And my feeling is actually at some point somebody's going to have to do something for free, and kind of where and how that happens is hard. And the minute you have a commercial enterprise involved, of course people should be being paid, but it's just getting to that point that is the challenge, I guess.
I think it sort of comes down back to what you were saying about the sort of slight ennui of rights people trying to sell foreign books into the English language, that they sort of well, and also there's politics, because they cannot pay for samples for all their authors. I mean, and once they start paying for a sample for one author, then the other author will say, but hang on a second, you translated 2 chapters of so-and-so's book into English. Why aren't you doing the same for mine? So they're incredibly wary of actually financing sample translations unless they're convinced they've got an absolute kind of hit or bestseller on their hands.
But I also think there's a bit of as an agent, I work for free a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, that's also true.
It's not... the awful truth is that in publishing, a lot of people are working for free a lot of the time. It's just kind of one of those things. And you have your own rules and regulations about what you will and won't do. But, we're in a business that's driven sort of predominantly by passion and interest and love. And I spend a lot of time working on things that don't ultimately go anywhere, and you sort of... You pick your... You take a punt, and some work out and some don't, and that's sort of how it goes. And that's not... it's very obvious for translators. It's perhaps less obvious for agents, but we do it all the time, and it's a part of the job.
But I really do think that every literature has its own commercial culture and special problems. And so, for example, if I speak to the editors I work with most, if they're interested in a book coming out of Spanish or German or French, they'll usually have at least one of those languages, and sometimes the translation from another language will have come in one of those languages first, so that they can do their own research. And for Turkish, the given, since there was so little that came out of Turkish for such a long time, you can't depend on that. And so the TEDA, the organization, the cultural organization that pays for most of our translations, actually pays for samples as well. The question about quality is another story, because the culture of translation is different, and translators don't get much respect in Turkey.
And so the payment of samples, I think, entirely depends on the situation. In a publishing house, it may be that publishing house isn't... If it's sort of French publishing house, it's chosen to prioritize certain books that it thinks are going to get into English, and they'll put their budget towards those, and maybe the other books. With agents, as Kerry says, we don't get paid until we sell the project, and we take our percentage. So if we were to invest in samples, that's quite... We'd have to feel an incredible confidence that we were going to kind of reap.
And we as an agency have and made it work a number of times, but we have to think pretty hard about it. It's tricky.
The ideal situation was the book that I sold to Stefan, where the author just translated himself. That was my perfect situation. I was like, well, that's...
Everyone's winning.
Yeah.
We've maybe got time for one quick last question. Or maybe...
Yeah, it was just... A question for Rebecca. I think you said earlier, and made a comment, it said if it was obvious that it was the perfect translation of a book, you would go with it. And that made me think, what would be the perfect translation from your point of view? I mean, it got to, perhaps it's a silly question, but what is then a bad translation if you don't speak the source language?
Well, if you don't speak the source language, that's a great. But even, I mean, with the Suite Française samples, I sat with those 7. And I just put them all in different orders. Like for about 3 days, I just kept shuffling them and changing my mind. It's not evident. It's an incredibly difficult decision to make.
I'd say one thing, that it is very good if you speak the language, but translation is as much about English as it is about the language from which it comes, and about literary English. So that's what you're looking at. Yeah.
From an editor or an agent's point of view, surely that translation then must read as if it were an English book. It's something that you could publish in English.
You mean
that was just the obvious question I would like to
the
have
level
confirmed.
of writing,
Yes.
you want it to read like it's not a translation. I mean,
Indeed,
but that's a whole other can of worms to open up, which we're not going to talk about right now.
Okay. Have we got time for one more? I don't know who's in charge of time.
Yeah, I don't know. We're like, maybe we stop.
Just a very quick question. What would be a respectable size of a sample? Are we talking pages, chapters, different parts of the book? I mean, what would be good from the editor's point of view?
No,
I know. I mean, it depends a bit on the book too. I mean, some books are clearer from a short section what the book's going to be than others. I mean, and obviously editors will always want to have as much as they can to read. I mean,
yeah, I think it's very hard because obviously, like, reading the beginning of a book isn't enough to, and often those first often the first chapter isn't necessarily the representative chapter, but on the other hand, to sort of pick bits through the book is also very tricky. So it's actually, I think you have to just take each text and really think about that text, really think about how could I convey this text to someone who can't read it, almost treat everything as its own individual sort of challenge in picking what bits you're going to do.
Okay, one more, and then I think that really is it.
I was just going to say that I've had very varied experience in producing samples, and I've done quite a lot unpaid, and I don't regret it because other times I have been paid, and I've been lucky enough to be paid for the very first time by an author, also by an agent, by publishers, and not at all. And but out of 10, nothing comes of it, but one time out of 10, something does come of it, a book comes of it. And it makes it all worthwhile. You just have to try and balance the paid with the unpaid work.
the other thing is the unpaid can actually be something which is good for the portfolio. It can be something which, for example, goes on a literary magazine like Asymptote, Words Without Borders, and then in the end, Words Without Borders will pay. I think Asymptote, I don't know what the latest is, I think they're getting that way. So, these things that you do unpaid can turn into paid things as well. And certainly something nice,
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists, and thank you all.